I'm going to cover the three following topics. I'm going to talk about how our brains process pleasure and pain by using the extended metaphor of a balance. I'm going to talk about the plenty paradox, which in essence is how our ancient wiring is mismatched for our modern ecosystem. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what we can do about it. So first, the pleasure-pain balance. Very exciting findings in neuroscience in the past 75 years, and one of those important scientific findings is the discovery of a dedicated pleasure circuit in our brain called the reward pathway, as well as the discovery of dopamine as a human brain neurotransmitter. Now, dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter involved in the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation, but it is the final common pathway for all reinforcing substances and behaviors. The more reinforcing something is, the more dopamine it releases in the pleasure or reward pathway, and the faster that dopamine is released. This slide represents a conglomeration of many different studies done over the years, showing how rodents respond to different types of rewards. So we all are releasing dopamine at a tonic baseline level, kind of like the heartbeat of our brain. Now, when a rodent ingests chocolate, that firing increases 55% above baseline, sex 100%, nicotine 150, cocaine 200, and amphetamine 1,000% above baseline. That doesn't necessarily mean that amphetamines are more addictive than chocolate because it depends on the individual. What releases a lot of dopamine in your reward pathway may not release as much in my reward pathway and vice versa. So how do we process pleasure and pain? We reflexively approach pleasure and avoid pain. We don't need to think about it. In fact, we need to think about the opposite. And one of the really exciting findings in neuroscience, to me anyway, is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. So the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. Imagine that in your reward pathway, there's a teeter-totter like in a kid's playground. When you do something pleasurable, it tips one way, and when you do something painful, it tips the other. But there are certain rules governing this balance, and I'm going to tell you three of them. The first and most important rule is that the balance wants to remain level, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis, so that with any deviation from neutrality, our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance. How do they do that? First, by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus is. That's called neuroadaptation. I like to think of that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring us level again. But those gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as we're level. They stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's that moment of wanting a second piece of chocolate or wanting to watch one more TikTok video. Now, if we wait long enough, those gremlins hop off and homeostasis is restored. But what if we don't wait? What if we continue to ingest our drug of choice over days to weeks to months to years? Those gremlins start to multiply. And pretty soon we have enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room. And then we are entering addicted brain. And this is what addicted brain looks like. Those gremlins are now camped out on the pain side of our balance, tents and barbecues in tow. Now we need our drug of choice not to feel pleasure, but just to level the balance and stop feeling pain. To illustrate this graphically, what we see is that with the initial exposure to a high dopamine reward, we get a huge increase in dopamine, followed by precipitous fall in dopamine levels, not just to baseline, but actually below baseline to that dopamine deficit state. That's that moment of craving. That can happen even while we're eating the piece of chocolate, right? We're already thinking about the next one. But if we resist, those gremlins hop off, and dopamine levels go back up to our baseline level position. But if we continue to ingest, what we find is that with repeated exposure to the same or similar reinforcing stimulus, that initial spike upwards gets shorter and weaker, but that after response gets stronger and longer, and eventually we can end up in a chronic dopamine deficit state. That is addiction. This is an image from a very famous study by neuroscientist Nora Volkoff, who's the head of NIDA, and her colleagues. And what you see here is the brains of healthy control subjects on the left-hand side Red represents dopamine transmission. And you see in their nucleus accumbens, or the reward pathway, there's plenty of red there, right? Good, healthy dopamine transmission. Now you have on the right-hand side the brains of individuals who have been using addictive substances for very long periods of time and stopped 2 weeks prior to this image. And you see very little dopamine transmission. They are in a chronic dopamine deficit state, and 2 weeks is importantly not enough to reverse that state. What is long enough? What we find in clinical care is that on average it takes about 4 weeks after we've stopped using our drug of choice, whether it's heroin or meth or TikTok or chocolate or, in my case, romance novels. Twilight was my gateway drug. Anyone else in here? Before we can restore those baseline levels of firing. Okay, so you've got the first 2 rules. The first rule is the opponent process mechanism. The way that we restore the balance is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That means for every pleasure, we pay a price. The second rule of the balance is that with repeated exposure to the same or similar drug, that initial deviation upward gets weaker and shorter, and that after response or the dopamine deficit state gets stronger and longer. The third rule of the balance: our brains remember. They remember forever, which means even those gremlins, once they've hopped off, they're lurking in the wings, eager to hop on again, which is why people with severe addiction can relapse with a single exposure to their drug of choice, even if they have abstained for years and years. It also means that we can be triggered not just by the drug, but by reminders of the drug. So what you see here is a rat that's been trained to know that if it sees a light, it can go to a lever, press it, and get intravenous cocaine, and you can see dopamine levels through that process. Let's just switch to the right-hand side of this graph, and you see a huge dopamine spike in response to cocaine. But what I want you to focus on is that response to the light itself. What happens when we're just reminded of our drug? We get a little bit high, right? A little spike in dopamine. And then right after, a little mini dopamine deficit state. That is craving, which is why we need to insulate ourselves not just from our drug of choice, but even things that remind us of our drug of choice. Some of my patients can be triggered even by euphoric recall of their drug. Here's what happens when we anticipate a certain reward and it doesn't come. That dopamine level goes way below baseline, right? We all know that a reward that you were expecting that doesn't come is much worse than a reward you were never expecting at all. So that speaks to some of our more modern digital drugs where we go on, our kids post something online, they get a ton of likes. The next time they do it, they don't get any likes, or maybe they get a bunch of hate. They're just not in neutral. They're going in a dopamine deficit state. For somebody who's vulnerable to addiction to that particular drug, that will drive them to do more work to get the levels up. It won't encourage them to stop doing that behavior. Okay, which brings us now to the plenty paradox. What I want to argue is that the reason that we're all so miserable is because we're working so hard to avoid being miserable. And in fact, overabundance itself is one of the most important modern day stressors. We were not physiologically wired for this world of overwhelming overabundance, which we have created. I have seen in the past 25 years of being in psychiatric practice, more and more people coming with severe anxiety, depression, chronic pain, in some cases suicidality, who have very wonderful lives. Everything you would associate with what we think of as the good life. Loving parents, of a robust social network, access to elite education, otherwise good physical health, and yet they can barely get out of bed in the morning. What is going on here? I believe that what's happening is that we, as both individuals and nations, are exposed to so many high-reward substances, from our coffee in the morning to that first text that we read to our Netflix binge at night, that we're all in a chronic dopamine deficit state, barely able to enjoy the modest rewards of life and experiencing more and more anxiety and depression. And bearing this out, if you look at world happiness surveys, it turns out in the last 20 years, people all over the world, including the United States, are less happy than they used to be, with people in the richest nations being the most unhappy. Rates of anxiety, depression, chronic pain are going up all over the world, with people in rich nations having the highest rates of increase. This incredible paradox can be explained by the notion of all of us being in some kind of dopamine deficit state. So what to do about it? It's easy to remember because it rhymes: abstain, maintain, and seek out pain. I'm glad you guys are a humorous group. That's great. So first, what's the first obvious thing that we have to do? We have to abstain from our drug for long enough for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance so that homeostasis can be restored. Why is that important? Because it allows us, again, to take pleasure in more modest rewards, but importantly, it also gives us insight. When we're chasing dopamine, we do not see true cause and effect. We need distance from our drug of choice in order to see the true impact that it's having on our lives, our relationships, also our mood, depression, anxiety. So it's very important first we abstain. How long? 4 weeks, again, on average, is the amount of time it takes to reset reward pathways. But if you can't do 4 weeks, do 2 weeks. If you can't do 2 weeks, do a week. If you can't do a week, do a single 24-hour period. And even if it's not long enough to reset reward pathways, it is long enough to experience the withdrawal symptoms. And the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. The next thing we need to do is after our dopamine fast, we need to figure out how to maintain those gains and re-enter into a healthy relationship with our drug of choice, or we need to figure out how to continue abstinence, depending upon what we decide. And the way to do that, importantly, is to create both literal and metacognitive barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice so that we can press the pause button between desire and consumption and aren't relying entirely on willpower. And that comes in geographical forms: get the potato chips out of the house, turn off your phone. Chronological, this is something like intermittent fasting. I'm only going to be on my device between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., and otherwise I'm going to give my brain a break. Categorical, that's where my patients who are addicted to video games say, okay, I can't play League of Legends, but it's okay if I play this other video game with my friends. And then finally, we have chemical. There are a lot of exciting medications that are coming out that can now help with this appetitive control. Many of you may have heard of Ozempic, which is now being used for people to lose weight. But interestingly, there are some preliminary studies suggesting it might also help people abstain from alcohol. And then finally, we can seek out pain, because those gremlins are agnostic to whatever the initial stimulus was. So if we intentionally press on the pain side of the balance, they will hop on the pleasure side of the balance, and they won't get off the level position. They'll stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the science of hormesis. Hormesis is Greek for to set in motion. What are we setting in motion? Our body's own upregulating mechanisms to increase our feel-good neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. Yay! Things like exercise, ice-cold water baths, fasting, prayer, meditation. This is a healthy way to get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. You can see here graphically what happens when we initiate the painful activity, let's say exercise. We slowly increase dopamine over the latter half, and then once we stop exercising, dopamine levels actually remain elevated for hours afterwards before going back down to the level position, so we never have to go into that dopamine deficit state. Thank you for listening. Yay. And I would just, my final challenge to all of you is to think of that thing that you use compulsively. Once you start, you have trouble stopping it, and give it up for just 24 hours. Plan it in advance, do it with a friend, and see how you do. Observe yourself in that withdrawal, but make it through, and then you might think about a different relationship you want to have with that substance going forward, including your phones.